Before the cannons roared, and before the British flags cast their shadow over India, there was an empire that ruled not just through its armies, but through its secrets. The Mughal Empire, gleaming with gold, art, and architecture, was also an empire of whispers. Beneath the grandeur of marble domes and royal courts, there pulsed an invisible system of surveillance and control so intricate that it could predict rebellion before it happened, sense disloyalty before it was spoken, and crush conspiracies before they were born. This was the Mughal spy network, a masterpiece of intelligence architecture, centuries ahead of its time. And unlike the loud triumphs of war, its victories were silent. It was the empire's nervous system, the unseen pulse that kept the Mughal throne alive through chaos, ambition, and betrayal. If you're watching this right now, pause for a moment. Where are you watching from, and what time is it there? The Mughals would have wanted to know. They always wanted to know everything. Who you are, where you are, who you speak to, and what you say when you think no one's listening. Before we uncover how this empire of shadows operated, make sure you like, share, and subscribe. It helps keep the knowledge alive, because what you're about to hear is not just history. It's the blueprint of how power watches, manipulates, and sustains itself even today. The story begins in the heart of Hindustan, during the reign of Jalaluddin Muhammad Akbar, the most brilliant strategist to ever sit on the peacock throne. Akbar understood something few rulers ever did. Swords win battles, but information wins empires. He had seen his father Humayun lose everything to betrayal and poor intelligence. He had learned from chaos that power was not built by force, but by foresight. And so he constructed something unprecedented, a living web of spies, informants, and messengers, all reporting directly to him. He called them the waqia-navis, the writers of events. But the term was misleading. These weren't mere scribes. They were embedded observers, watchers disguised as clerks, merchants, priests, travelers, and soldiers. They operated everywhere the Mughal sun shone, inside palaces, mosques, markets, and military camps. Each province had a network, each noble had a watcher, and each governor's circle had an informer pretending to be his ally. The empire's vastness, stretching from Kabul to Bengal, was stitched together not by roads or armies, but by this invisible lattice of observation. Every day, hundreds of reports flowed toward the capital, coded, sealed, and handled with ceremonial secrecy. These weren't letters of gossip. They contained information about troop movements, local rumors, harvest yields, and spiritual movements that might threaten state stability. Some reports even detailed who had bowed too low before a provincial lord, or who had whispered discontent in the marketplace. Akbar's court chronicler, Abul Fazl, wrote that the pen of information writes faster than the sword. The emperor would read these reports personally, analyzing the currents of loyalty and fear that flowed beneath the empire's surface. To the outside world, the Mughal court appeared as a beacon of culture and sophistication, music, poetry, and architecture. But behind that brilliance was an iron web of surveillance. Akbar's spies even infiltrated temples and monasteries. Every saint, scholar, and mystic with growing influence was quietly monitored. The emperor was deeply interested in the mind of his people, the psychology of obedience, the rhythm of rumor, the contagion of rebellion. The Mughal spy system wasn't just about control, it was a psychological study of human nature at scale. The beauty of Akbar's network was in its balance. It wasn't built purely on fear, it was built on reward, reputation, and subtle manipulation. Spies weren't always coerced. Many worked willingly, seduced by the prestige of serving the emperor or the access it granted them to higher circles. Some spies were poets, some were priests, others were merchants who could travel unnoticed between cities. They carried intelligence as traders carry silk, folded, layered, and hidden beneath the surface. To keep his network airtight, Akbar ensured that no single person had the full picture. Every spy's report went through layers of intermediaries. No one knew who else was watching or being watched. The result was a self-sustaining circle of paranoia that kept even the highest officials loyal. Governors suspected their ministers. Ministers suspected their scribes. The emperor trusted everyone and no one. It was a form of systemic psychological control that kept the empire unified through constant uncertainty. By the late 16th century, Akbar had created something that no ruler in Asia or Europe had yet achieved, a centralized information state. His waqia-navis network became the envy of visiting diplomats. Jesuit missionaries who entered the court noted the astonishing speed with which the emperor learned of distant events. A skirmish in Bengal or a rebellion in Kabul would be reported to Akbar within days, sometimes before his generals on the ground had even reacted. It was as if the empire had eyes everywhere. But Akbar's genius didn't stop there. He used information not only to suppress threats, but to craft perception. He knew that controlling the narrative was as vital as knowing the facts. Through the same spy channels, he spread his own messages, stories of divine vision, justice, and mercy, to keep the population in awe. What began as intelligence gathering became an early form of psychological propaganda. The people were being told what to think of their emperor, and they believed it. However, every system built on secrets eventually consumes itself. When Akbar died in 1605, his successors inherited a machine they could barely control. Jahangir, his son, tried to keep the spy network intact, but he was more interested in pleasure and art than in surveillance. Corruption crept in. Spies began selling information to rival factions. Nobles created private networks of their own. The Mughal web began to fracture, and with it came the rise of hidden wars, fought not with armies but with intelligence leaks. Still, the Mughal system had already left its mark. It inspired later forms of intelligence during Shah Jahan's rule, the emperor who built the Taj Mahal. He used the same spy infrastructure to track trade routes, collect economic data, and monitor the movement of caravans. Every merchant route was charted, every port catalogued. The Mughals had essentially created a proto-economic surveillance system centuries before modern intelligence agencies did. Behind the beauty of the empire's art and architecture lay a mind of pure calculation. But then came Aurangzeb, the emperor of discipline, devotion, and fear. Under his reign, the Mughal spy network evolved into something far darker. Aurangzeb distrusted everyone. He reinstated strict surveillance over both the nobility and the common people. Spies now reported, not just on rebellion, but on morality, who attended forbidden festivals, who questioned religious authority, who spoke of equality. Surveillance merged with piety. The state no longer just watched, it judged. Yet even Aurangzeb, with all his rigor, couldn't hold the empire together forever. The network that had once been Akbar's strength became Aurangzeb's burden. Too much information led to confusion, paranoia, and stagnation. Spies began fabricating reports to please the throne. Governors manipulated intelligence to destroy rivals. The empire, suffocated by its own web, began to unravel from within. And yet, the legacy endured. Long after the Mughal Empire crumbled, the British would later study and adapt this system. The British East India Company's early intelligence divisions were built on the same principles of coded reporting, merchant informants, and religious infiltration that the Mughals had perfected. The colonial intelligence services were, in many ways, descendants of the Mughal waqia-navis. When you think of the Mughal Empire today, you think of marble and minarets, not invisible ink and encoded scrolls. But beneath the art and opulence was a ghost empire, an empire of data before data existed. Its rulers understood that knowledge was the truest form of wealth, and secrecy the purest form of power. Every empire that followed, British, Ottoman, even modern governments, copied parts of the Mughal model, the art of knowing everything without being seen. So when we look back at the Mughals, what do we truly see? A civilization of builders and warriors, yes, but also of watchers and whisperers. The waqia-navis were the invisible chroniclers of the empire, and their ink wrote the fate of millions. In their hands, truth became a weapon, silence a strategy, and loyalty a gamble. Their world wasn't divided between right and wrong. It was divided between those who knew and those who didn't. And that perhaps is the real secret of the Mughal Empire. It survived not because of divine right or military brilliance, but because of information control. It knew what every empire must eventually learn. The most powerful throne is the one built on secrets. When an empire begins to die, it doesn't die in battlefields or through declarations. It dies in the silence between secrets. The Mughal Empire, once the most magnificent force on the Indian subcontinent, began to rot not at its borders but at its core. Its collapse wasn't caused by swords or muskets. It was caused by the corrosion of trust. The very system that once held the empire together, the intricate network of spies, informers, and watchers, began to feed on itself. It became a labyrinth of deceit where truth was no longer distinguishable from manipulation. Every report carried both knowledge and poison, and the emperor could never tell which was which. After Aurangzeb's long reign, the empire was exhausted. Decades of religious tension, endless wars, and internal purges had drained not only the treasury, but the will to govern. The intelligence system that had once made the empire omniscient now made it paranoid. Governors feared that every conversation was overheard, every servant might be an informer, every act of loyalty might be a trap. The waqia-navis, once noble chroniclers of events, turned into extortionists, selling information to rival princes or ambitious generals. Corruption didn't just spread through the administration, it became the administration. By the early 18th century, the Mughal spy web was no longer a net, it was a broken mirror. Each shard reflected a distorted version of truth. The emperors who followed Aurangzeb were ghosts of power, weak, isolated, surrounded by flatterers who spoke what they wanted to hear. Reports that reached Delhi were no longer intelligence but theater, carefully crafted lies to maintain appearances. The Mughal system, designed to prevent deception, had become deception itself. Meanwhile, the world around them was changing. A new kind of intelligence was rising, one driven not by loyalty to empire, but by profit. The British East India Company had begun weaving its own web across India. To the Mughals, they seemed like merchants. But to those who watched closely, these merchants behaved more like diplomats, agents, and analysts. They mapped every region they traded in. They recorded the psychology of kings, the weaknesses of governors, the language of every port. Where the Mughal spies used paper, the British used trade ledgers. Where Mughal agents sent handwritten codes, the British sent coded letters disguised as invoices. But here's the irony. The British didn't invent their system. They learned it. They learned it from the dying Mughal court. British officials stationed in Delhi and Bengal began observing how Mughal intelligence operated. The flow of reports, the chain of informants, the language of coded dispatches. They saw how information could rule a land more efficiently than armies ever could, and in the ruins of a decaying empire, they found the perfect blueprint. It was the Bengal Suba that became the first testing ground. There, under the nominal rule of the Mughal-appointed Nawab Siraj-ud-Dowlah, British officials quietly began bribing local waqia-navis. These men had once sworn to report only to the Mughal emperor, but the emperor's power was now distant, almost mythical. The British, on the other hand, offered something far more tangible: money, security, and purpose. The Mughal intelligence machine didn't collapse, it was absorbed. The same spies who had once served Akbar and Aurangzeb now whispered into British ears. By the time of the Battle of Plassey in 1757, the transformation was complete. Robert Clive didn't just defeat the Nawab with soldiers, he defeated him with spies. The British already knew the size of the Nawab's army, the temperament of his generals, and the exact moment when betrayal would fracture his command. When Mir Jafar switched sides, it wasn't a sudden act of treason. It was a move long prepared by months of British intelligence. The Mughal system of observation had finally been turned against itself. From that point onward, the British didn't just conquer territories, they conquered information. Every province under their growing control was studied, documented, and categorized. And what was once a sacred act of imperial vigilance in the Mughal age became a cold, mechanical system of surveillance. The British called it administration, but in reality, it was the Mughal waqia-navis reborn, industrialized, westernized, and weaponized. Yet there was a deeper tragedy. The Mughal Empire had once used its intelligence system to maintain balance, to understand its people, to avoid chaos, to preserve harmony among diverse religions and cultures. But the British used it to divide. They studied caste, tribe, and language, not to unify, but to fragment. They turned data into division. Where Akbar had sought to understand, the British sought to control. Where the Mughal spies observed faith and custom to protect the empire, the colonial spies observed them to exploit and manipulate. The tools remained the same, only the intention changed. Inside Delhi, as the last emperors watched their influence evaporate, fragments of the old spy network still operated, ghosts loyal to no one. Some served the fading Mughal court, others worked for the British, and some switched sides depending on who paid better. These shadow agents became legends in their own right, men and women who could walk into rival courts disguised as astrologers, singers, or traders. Their reports traveled through secret codes hidden in poetry, musical notes, and even religious chants. One story speaks of a spy who carried information written on the underside of rose petals, another of a dancer whose anklets carried tiny scrolls between the bells. By the 19th century, British officers like William Sleeman and Thomas Metcalfe were actively recruiting Indian informants, studying Mughal spy traditions to refine their own. They learned the art of blending religion, trade, and rumor into intelligence work, something the Mughals had perfected centuries earlier. In Sleeman's letters, you can still trace admiration for the Mughal intelligence legacy. "Their eyes and ears are everywhere," he once wrote, "and their tongues carry more danger than 1,000 swords." But even as the British grew stronger, something remarkable happened. The same intelligence systems they had inherited from the Mughals began to work against them. Rebellion doesn't need guns, it needs information. During the First War of Independence in 1857, rebel leaders used Mughal-style spy rings to communicate secretly between cities. Messages were hidden in prayer books, carried by fakirs and beggars, passed from one temple courtyard to another. The British were blindsided not by armies, but by whispers, the very weapon they had stolen. In a strange way, the ghosts of the Mughal waqia-navis had returned to haunt their new masters. The intelligence network that had once served emperors now fueled insurgency. The same streets that once echoed with the orders of imperial informants now carried revolutionary messages. It was poetic justice. The empire built on secrets was undone by them. The story doesn't end there. When India finally slipped out of colonial hands centuries later, it inherited yet another version of that same ancient system. Modern Indian intelligence agencies, RAW, IB, and even state-level CID, are descendants of that legacy. Their roots lie in the Mughal art of intelligence, polished through British structure and reborn in a modern state. The continuity is staggering. Every encrypted report, every informant, every classified file traces its ancestry back to the dusty halls of Akbar's palace, where the first waqia-navis quietly dipped his pen in ink and began writing the empire's fate. What makes the Mughal spy network so hauntingly relevant is not just its sophistication, but its philosophy. The Mughals understood that power doesn't survive through dominance, it survives through awareness. They built an empire not of walls, but of ears. Their greatest monuments weren't made of marble or stone, but of secrets. The domes of the Taj Mahal might shimmer in sunlight, but the true architecture of empire was invisible, a network of trust, betrayal, and insight. Imagine the capital of Agra in its prime, the emperor's court glittering with jewels, the corridors filled with ministers, musicians, and mystics. Somewhere in that crowd stood a man in plain robes, unnoticed, silent. He wasn't there for glory or gold. He was listening. Behind his calm face, every word was being measured, every tone analyzed, every expression recorded. That man's report could determine the rise or fall of a noble, the success of a policy, or even the survival of the throne. That was the silent power of the Mughal intelligence system. It didn't need violence, because it could destroy reputations, twist loyalties, and preempt rebellions before they were born. When you think about it, the Mughal spy network was more than just an early intelligence agency. It was a mirror of human nature. It revealed what every ruler fears most, the truth that power is fragile, that control is an illusion, and that knowledge, even dangerous knowledge, is the only thing that endures. In today's world, as governments collect data, monitor citizens, and wage wars of information, the Mughal system doesn't seem so ancient anymore. What Akbar built with ink and parchment has evolved into the algorithms and surveillance systems of modern power. The empire of whispers has become the empire of data. The tools have changed, but the principle remains the same. Those who control information control reality. So when you walk through the ruins of a Mughal fort or see the reflection of the Taj Mahal on the Yamuna River, remember this: those stones once housed a civilization that mastered the science of secrets. They didn't just rule with armies, they ruled with awareness. Their downfall wasn't caused by invasion, but by the failure to protect their own information ecosystem. And in that lesson lies a warning for every modern power. No empire, however mighty, can survive once it forgets how to listen, because the truth always whispers before it roars. And the Mughals, the masters of whisper, knew that better than anyone.